The history of uranium, plutonium, and missile development are all strongly intertwined. Uranium has for centuries been recognized as a strong source of energy. Its natural radioactivity means that no chemical reactions has to take place for uranium to produce energy. But it was the discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 that led to the realization of uranium's full destructive potential. Leo Szilard saw this potential and wrote a letter signed by Albert Einstein to then President Franklin Roosevelt, warning of the menace of a German nuclear power. The entire history of nuclear proliferation and nuclear compromise began with a request from the US government. Named the Manhattan Engineering District or the Manhattan Project, the US put a total of $25 billion adjusted for inflation and over 130,000 people to develop and to test the most powerful weapon ever made, the nuclear bomb. The first milestone of the Manhattan Project came when the first nuclear weapon, codenamed Trinity, is tested in New Mexico on July 16th of 1945, having a yield equal to 20,000 tons of TNT. As more and more tests were performed, and amid the incredible losses from World War II, the US became the first country to detonate an atomic bomb for warfare reasons. President Truman ordered the dropping of the uranium bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and the second above the Japanese city of Nagasaki just a few days later on August 9th, killing hundreds of thousands of people over the course of months and years due to both the initial blast and the incredibly dangerous radiation. This marks the first and last time a nuclear weapon has been used in warfare. On the 10th of January 1946, the very first meeting of the UN occurred. In that meeting, the United Nations General Assembly called for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons after observing the tragedy of what happened in Japan. Professor Nina Tenenwald writes in her book, The Nuclear Taboo, that the 1946 gathering of the United Nations is the origin of what she refers to as nuclear taboo. Tenenwald states that the UN meeting led President Truman and the UN as a whole to adopt a series of policy positions which differentiated nuclear weapons from other weapons of war. She furthers that these efforts were propelled by fears of the overwhelming destructive power of nuclear weapons. Out of the first UN conference came both diplomatic and tacit agreements to never use nuclear weapons in warfare. And while tested by time and the complexities of geopolitics, the agreement still stands. Tenenwald furthers that at the same time, quote, the US military and political leaders perceived the military value of atomic weapons, and starting in 1948 began to develop military policy around their use, end quote. Stuart Symington, Secretary of the Air Force, argued that, quote, if the United States were to lose a war because of the failure to use the bomb for humanitarian reasons, we should be guilty of the greatest disservice to civilization in the history of mankind. The arms race began in earnest on August 29, 1949, when the Soviets became just the second country to successfully test an atom bomb. Called First Lightning, the impact itself was much larger than the pure power of the detonation itself. Tensions were high. Nuclear holocaust seemed all but inevitable. This was the beginning of the Cold War. The world was at the brink of war. Oddly, some argue that nuclear weapons were the ones that kept the world from war itself. This is because of the principle of mutually assured destruction, which in turn is based on the idea of nuclear parity. If your opponent has equal offensive nuclear capabilities to your own, any strike will inevitably lead to retaliation. Tensions reached their peak when the United States discovered Soviet nuclear missiles on the coast of Cuba on October 16, 1962.
Compromise came 4 days later when President Khrushchev of the Soviet Union and President Kennedy agreed that the USSR would withdraw missiles if the United States promised not to invade Cuba. Just less than 6 years later, on the 1st of July 1968, both the United States and the Soviet Union would sign the Multilateral Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The treaty was signed with the ultimate goal of stopping the spread of nuclear weapons. It was a rare moment, the Soviet Union and the United States coming together to stop what they believed was a devastating threat. Both states believed that nuclear weapons made the world increasingly dangerous, and both tried to make sure that no new countries entered the nuclear club. The treaty recognized 5 nuclear powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, and France. In total, By 1970, 97 parties had signed the treaty. Today, the treaty has 190 members, making it the largest arms treaty in the world. Some, like Jeffrey Knopf, argue that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was a rousing success. He states that while the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty itself was not wholly successful, it set precedent for future cooperation between nuclear and non-nuclear states. He furthers that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty allowed states to create their own mechanisms to organize interstate cooperation on nuclear non-proliferation. Others, like Matthew Kronig, believe that international cooperation is what drives nuclear proliferation in the first place. In his book, Exploring the Bomb, Technology Transfer and the Spread of Nuclear Weapons, he states that nearly every country with a nuclear weapon arsenal receives substantial help at some point from a more advanced nuclear state. He concludes that the best way to limit nuclear proliferation is to limit international cooperation. The spread of nuclear weapons to India supports Kronig's conclusion. The United States' decision to uphold its agreement to provide fuel to a nuclear reactor in Tarapur ultimately allowed for India to successfully develop a nuclear weapon. While India had tested a nuclear weapon before, it was unable to develop a nuclear weapon without substantial help from a more advanced nuclear state, as Kronig theorized. In the case of Israel, we see similarities as the Israelis cultivated relationships with French scientists and politicians with the ultimate goal of building a nuclear bomb with the aid of the French. The Israelis would ultimately succeed and have nearly 100 nuclear weapons today. Only Pakistan differs from Kronig's theory, as the Pakistanis seem to have developed nuclear weapons out of sheer force of will to oppose India.
In 1950, prior to the Cold War, the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Party of Korea launched an attack on the pro-Western Republic of Korea. Because any tension or the conflict in the region posed a potential threat of escalating to a worldwide scale, the Americans searched for a way to end the war. Eventually, such an agreement was reached, and a ceasefire was declared. In 1985, North Korea signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, an international agreement with the intention of preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. The deal would not remain forever, as George Bush's decision to withdraw from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty triggered North Korean retaliation, and it came in the form of a reinvestment in their nuclear facilities. Quote, "The reason why the Sunshine Policy could not be fully completed and was not a full success was because of stalled U.S.-North Korean relations," end quote, said one Bush official interview with the Associated Press in 2006. Today, North Korea has an estimated 10 nuclear weapons, including a miniaturized nuclear weapon that can be mounted on an intercontinental ballistic missile that may be able to reach the United States. The history of nuclearization is long and fraught, and has brought the world to the brink of war on several occasions. Through peace and diplomacy alone, humanity persists.
Since Szilard and Turner first theorized about nuclear fission, its awesome potential has captivated mankind. Some, like Einstein, warned against the development of nuclear weapons. Some, like Secretary of the Air Force Stuart Symington, believe that nuclear weapons are costly but ultimately a necessary evil. He affirms this in a 1948 speech where he stated that if the United States were to lose a war because of the failure to use bombs for humanitarian reasons, we should be guilty of the greatest disservice to civilization in the history of mankind. Some go so far as to say that nuclear weapons have actually deterred war because of the principles of mutually assured destruction and nuclear parity. Regardless, Richard Campbell and Robert Einhorn quantify that by the turn of this century, upwards of 9 countries had nuclear weapons. It is indisputable that the proliferation of nuclear weapons has changed the world as we know it, and it is one of the utmost importance that we fully understand this complex geopolitical issue, as one mistake could end the world as we know it. Through conflict and compromise, the nuclear age has been forged.